At this time, I'm pleased to welcome our panel for today's webinar, the editorial staff of the Central Penn Business Journal. First, let me welcome Roger Dupree to the panel. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning, Sean. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, great.
Roger, why don't you take a moment here and please tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Great. I've been with the Business Journal for 14 months, and I cover transportation and manufacturing, among other things. And what I'm going to talk about today is the impact of the last night's election on particularly manufacturing and international trade.
Great. Thank you, Roger, for your time this morning.
Thanks. Next,
we have Lene Rule. Good morning, Lene.
Good morning, Sean.
Please take a moment, if you wouldn't mind, to tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Well, I've been reporting on healthcare for the Business Journal for about a year and a half, and this morning I will be talking about the impact of the election on the healthcare industry.
Great. Thanks, Lene, for joining us. Now welcome Jason Scott to the panel. Morning, Jason.
Morning, Sean.
Thanks for being here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I've been here at the Business Journal about 5 years. I mostly cover construction and real estate. This morning I'm going to hit on the elections result mostly on the construction industry.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to have you here.
Thanks.
Now my pleasure to welcome our newest writer for the CPBJ, Jennifer Wentz, to the conversation. Jennifer, would you please give us a little bit of a snapshot about your background?
Sure. I'm the banking reporter for the Biz Journal. I used to work as the assistant editor at a newspaper in Hanover, and today I will be talking about the effect that a Trump presidency could have on banking regulations as well as the effect on the stock market.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Welcome. Our final panelist today is David O'Connor. Thank you, David, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, everyone.
David, why don't you take a moment here and tell the audience a little bit about yourself as well.
I've been with the Business Journal for nearly a year. I cover the business communities in York and Lancaster County. I also cover higher education, nonprofits, and the workforce sector. Today I will be addressing the impact of the Trump presidency on the workforce issue.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And thank you to all of our panelists this morning. This should be an incredible discussion. I'm excited to hear what each of you have to say. Our moderators for today are CPBJ editor Joel Berg and CPBJ managing editor Kathy Herko. Joel will be leading this morning's discussion, while Kathy will be monitoring the questions queue, as well as our live Twitter chat through our handle @CPBJ. Good morning, Joel and Kathy.
Morning. Good morning, Sean.
Thank you very much for making the time. Almost must be an incredibly busy day. Joel, Kathy, why not tell our listeners a little about yourselves, and let's begin. I'm sure our audience is eager to hear what the panel has to say about the results of last night's historic election.
Thank you, Sean. This is a sleep-deprived Joel Berg. I was up until about 1:30 watching the results come in, and then up again at 4 to help us cover them, to begin to kick off our coverage for the day, which we started really around 6 o'clock this morning and are continuing. I've been a journalist for about 20 years, been here at the Business Journal for a year and a half, covered primarily banking, healthcare, the environment, insurance, and just general business over the course of those years. Covered a number of presidential elections, and this one probably is as historic as Bush's defeat of Gore in 2000 in terms of delivering what many saw as a surprise. Clearly, voters are not interested in, after 2 terms of one president, they are not interested, or at least a plurality of them are not interested in more of the same, and that seems to be what we have here. And that is going to both make things somewhat easier for Trump, perhaps, to be a disruptive force, but also complicate it, because now this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, for the Republican president, Republican Congress, and it is really ultimately now the ball is in their court to deliver some of the things that they have promised voters throughout this election. And obviously, we will be covering it for the next months, years, and looking forward to it, especially for our audience of business owners and executives who, do have quite a big stake in some of the decisions that will be made about healthcare, about regulation, about trade, about banking rules, a great number of things that will likely affect the economy and the operations of their businesses. So we'll start. Well, part of the challenge, of course, for Trump, as many commentators have noticed, will be filling in the details. But one area where there is a lot of detail, where he has expressed some very clear thoughts, is on trade, and that is where we turn to our staff writer, Roger Dupuis, who will talk about the impact of Trump and his potential, the next 4 years on manufacturing and international exports. Take it away, Roger.
Thank you, Joel, so much. Well, you're absolutely right. There have been details in this regard, and I think one of the things that's so frustrating for a lot of folks is that those details scare people. I covered both of, two of Mr. Trump's rallies here in the Mid-State. He was here a number of times, but the first two at the farm show and in Cumberland County, and what he was absolutely clear about, yes, as he was last night, is that he intends to impose tariffs on companies that import goods from overseas, and particularly those companies which formerly made them over here. We've heard the Carrier air conditioning example so many times. I heard it at both Harrisburg rallies, and we've heard it many times in his speeches, that if you take jobs out of the United States and you are building the product somewhere else, particularly Mexico, and you try to bring them back, he's going to impose tariffs, and he's talked about a number in the range of 35%. What's sort of interesting about all this is that the president does have a great deal of latitude in this regard, but it's not absolute latitude. So given that he will be facing a Republican Congress, there's a very good chance that he may have his way, but it's not absolute. One of the interesting things about trade deals is that while they tend to be negotiated by large parties and they are fairly technical and there are massive legal documents, the president in the end has what's known as fast-track approval, the authority to fast-track approve these things. And what that means is that Congress can come back and say yes or no, but they may not amend and they may not filibuster. So Trump does have a lot of latitude here. The question, of course, is whether or not Mr. Trump single-handedly could decide to renegotiate NAFTA, which is involving the United States, Canada, and Mexico, or trade deals with other countries overseas, and then get their leaders to agree. Okay, so that's what I think folks are really nervous about, is that Mr. Trump says, and he said it here in his rallies, that I'm going to renegotiate deals, and they will be good deals because, of course, as you know, he is the deal maker. He wrote a book in 1987 called The Art of the Deal, and he prides himself on being able to negotiate things like high-rise construction and hotel contracts. But can he get the Chinese government to sit down and agree to things like ending their currency manipulation and ending their extensive state support for industries like steel, which has been very, very problematic for the United States and countries around the world. So that is sort of issue number one. What I think folks might find really interesting is that there's a cross-cutting cleavage here, that there are a lot of Democrats who are actually anti-trade, and particularly union Democrats who are against these trade deals because they feel, quite correctly, that when you produce goods overseas, it leads to fewer jobs here in the United States. Okay. President Obama and Mrs. Clinton were great proponents of trade deals, such as the proposed TPP, and Mr. Trump is not. So I've talked to a number of folks, and that you will see reflected in a story on our website this morning about how he will, how his presidency will affect trade. And there are some people, I think folks who are looking at the big picture holistically, who say the goods that we purchase in the United States, the goods that consumers like us buy at Walmart and Target and other places at very low cost, come to us because they are produced in other countries with whom we have trade deals and because the cost of production there is lower. And if all of a sudden you dry up this pipeline, you're not only going to do damage to the companies which import these things, but you're going to ultimately hurt the American consumer. And in the end, that doesn't create jobs either. But on the other hand, you do have folks in manufacturing who say, look, we do still produce things in the United States, and some of that process involves either purchasing components from overseas or sending components overseas to be built into a final product which is then sold here. So these things are very, very complex, as we've discussed. And even across the business community, I think there is both trepidation and confusion about exactly what he can do and whether he should do it. So that is a somewhat long-winded answer to a short question, which is, will he be good at manufacturing? Well, it's hard to say. If he really decides to take on, the government of China and the people of Mexico single-handedly, it could be potentially dangerous. And Carrier air conditioning, which comes up again and again and again in many of his speeches, might very well come back and potentially, sue the government if they feel they're being singled out with an unfair tariff. So there's that. I did want to say one other thing, which is not directly related to this, but we should be cognizant of this morning, that you folks may have seen that the markets began to plunge last night. The markets really don't like uncertainty. It's an old axiom, and it's very true. And the markets were expecting, as I think a lot of folks, including some people in the Trump camp initially were, that Mrs. Clinton was going to do very well. And as soon as her numbers turned south very quickly last night, you watched the markets first in Asia and then rolling into Europe, plummeting deeply. and then it began to affect futures on the U.S. stock markets. What I would say is that it seems this morning after the Dow has opened that they're rebounding a little bit, and so this is going to be something that we need to keep an eye on. But there are a lot of interesting correlations to this. I mean, one is that the price of gold is going up, and that is something that people tend to invest in when they're very, very nervous, and particularly in times of instability. And the impact on the dollar could be interesting long term. I mean, I saw some initial reports that traders were selling. On the other hand, the Mexican peso, which some people have seen as the barometer of Mr. Trump's candidacy, had gone down for weeks. And then as Mrs. Clinton appeared to be doing well yesterday, it rebounded and then dropped on the order of 13% after it became obvious after midnight that Mr. Trump really was heading for victory. So all of those things in their way affect our balance of trade, right? You know, the ability of other countries to trade with us because they can afford our currency. And I will say going forward that Mexico is going to be a very interesting country to watch because many, many American products are produced there. Many companies, we've written about many of them, Hershey, Mondelez, which produces Oreo cookies, have at various points moved their production lines or certain production lines to Mexico. So a lot of things we buy as consumers on a regular basis are produced there. And Donald Trump, of course, proposes to build a wall. Now, let's put the wall in and of itself aside for a moment. We are such a dominant trading partner with Mexico that if we sneeze, they catch a cold. And not only is their currency potentially impacted, but we forget that all of the folks who move up here tend to send a lot of money back to their family members in Mexico. And so the way in which we affect their economy could be devastating to the people who work in that country, but also to the American multinationals that have plants down there. So, yes.
All right. Thank you, Roger. I do have some questions, but we will move on. We'll save our questions for the end, and we will move now to healthcare, which is obviously another big issue. Clearly, a lot of the discontent in the country that led to Trump's victory probably stemmed from Obamacare, which promised to make healthcare more affordable, hence the name Affordable Care Act, but has apparently done little to slow the growth in healthcare costs and insurance costs. And of course, just before the election, we did have a round of steep increases in plans sold on the Obamacare marketplace. And of course, we've heard a lot from insurers, how they're hurting. We have heard a lot from doctors, how they have trouble with these plans. So we will turn things over to Lene, who will brief us on what we might expect from Donald Trump in the arena of healthcare, starting with, of course, the Affordable Care Act.
All right, thank you, Joel. So Trump proposes to repeal Obamacare immediately when he goes into office, and I think the general consensus is there's a lot of concern on exactly how he will unravel the Affordable Care Act, because it not only touches insurance companies, doctors, patients, but also businesses who are now required to report that they're providing adequate coverage for employees. And the biggest impact of repealing the Affordable Care Act will probably be on the marketplace. So individual people who are enrolled in insurance, about 20 million people now have access to health insurance through that new law. So exactly how you unravel that is a big question for Trump going forward. Some of his plans for health care include allowing individuals to have health savings accounts that would be tax-free. He also talks a little bit about modifying the law so that health insurance companies can sell health plans across states. And exactly how his plan will make health care more affordable is a big question for everybody. People aren't exactly saying or willing to comment on how repealing the Affordable Care Act will impact the healthcare industry immediately. But so lots of questions there. And then also repealing it would take away the Cadillac tax, which is something that's looming out there for businesses, and that would tax them 40% on health insurance plans that exceed certain values. So probably see a lot of change with the Affordable Care Act.
That's for sure. Thank you, Lene. All right. Moving on to real estate and construction. Obviously, some of the economic pain this country has felt in the last decade does come from the crash in the real estate market in 2007 and 2008. And that market, as Jason Scott, our real estate reporter, has been reporting on, that market has been gaining strength, including here in central Pennsylvania. So, of course, the big question is, where does it go? Where does that market go under President Trump, and what happens next? So I will let Jason take it away from there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we've seen a lot of growth in residential real estate here in the midstate for about the last 5 years. I mean, more so in the last year or two, a lot of double-digit growth quarter after quarter in terms of home sales. But leading up to the election, we heard from a lot of construction folks, both residential and commercial, primarily about regulation, broader regulation, that they were seeking some reform, seeking some relief, saying that projects take longer, they cost more. So there was a lot more pro-Trump sentiment based on things that they'd heard throughout the campaign. Feeling was kind of, yes, he's the unknown in terms of being a politician, so that's a little scary, as we've seen in other industries. But that he knew the industry, he's been in that business. A lot of folks felt like he'd bring a new energy. He'd peel back layers of regulation, as I said, that have added time and money to projects. A lot of folks talked about the ACA and how if you could make some adjustments there as it relates to healthcare costs, that would free up some spending that folks could put to use other places. There was a lot of chatter about the infrastructure spending between the two candidates. Certainly, a lot of folks felt like he had the advantage in that front because he had talked about $1 trillion in spending on infrastructure versus Secretary Clinton had talked about $275 billion. However, there's also another concern as the market, as construction has continued to rebound over the last number of years. You've seen a lot more projects steadily come about. Like I said, more housing. Everything's kind of been steadily kicking up. There's been a concern about a shortage in skilled labor. We were hearing about that. So the kind of ties into what Roger was talking about with the wall. The immigration impact is also in play here. Could that impact the trades in other states that were maybe more reliant on Hispanic workers as far as projects go? So there was some concern about that. Also, we heard a little bit of chatter regarding student loans and college tuition in the country. Folks were saying there'd be more first-time buyers if you could do more to reduce student loan interest rates, make secondary education more affordable. That would increase the talent pool out there in the broader workforce. That would help more people be able to afford to buy homes. We know that the home ownership rate in the country has continued to go down, that we've become more of a country of renters. So there's a lot of back and forth as it relates to real estate and construction on both sides, both residential and commercial. And another thing on regulation that we heard a little bit more, it was mostly more of the environmental impacts. We heard a little bit more about the Clean Water Act and the issues that might present to folks moving forward. We know that Donald Trump has talked about about regulations best left to individual states, that we shouldn't be the EPA shouldn't be trying to control farmland, things like that. We also heard a lot about the corporate tax structure, his proposal to cut things to 15% from 35%, and how that would just be a nice long-term boon to the economy overall. And then one other kind of offshoot to that was there were some folks who talked about in the home building industry regarding energy. Certainly, they feel like he'd be better for fracking, better for energy. More people working in those industries means higher paid positions, people who can afford to buy more homes, and that should be good for the overall housing market. So there's a lot of things at play, but by and large, I think folks are more comfortable long term under a Trump presidency than they would have been under Clinton, even though they even though they partially called her kind of like the 30-year fixed mortgage, you knew what you were going to get from her because it would have been a carryover from the current administration. But long term, they see more spending in their industry, which they all like. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
All right. We moved from real estate to the other industry that was raised heavily or came up a lot during the election campaign, and that's banking. In many cases, banks were seen as villains for their role or alleged role in the financial crash in 2008. Although, of course, there is a distinction between the very large banks and the community banks, many of which we have locally. However, most banks of all sizes have been subject to more regulation over the last 60 years, and that has been a source of frustration for bankers since then. And my guess, we'll hear from Jenny herself, but our guess is that they will probably look forward to some lightening of the load under Trump, whereas they probably would have gotten even heavier regulation under Clinton. So they must be breathing some sigh of relief this morning.
Right. It's one area where Donald Trump was really consistent throughout the entire campaign. He was very against Dodd-Frank. He's been saying, for the past, however long he was running, that he wanted to either dismantle it or significantly overhaul it. One phrase that came up a lot among Republicans was that Dodd-Frank was a legislative Godzilla that was, kind of tearing through on a warpath and kind of destroying these community banks and credit unions and these other small institutions that weren't supposed to be the ones affected by it. The whole intention of Dodd-Frank was to kind of rein in the bigger banks that allegedly caused the 2008 recession. But what a lot of community bankers have been saying is that they've kind of felt a lot of the consequences of it. They have restrictions on mortgages and lending, which ultimately they say hurts consumers. And then more and more banks are resorting to mergers and things like that. So the overall number of community banks in the country has dropped. And a lot of people do blame Dodd-Frank for part of that. As far as what exactly Donald Trump will do to dismantle Dodd-Frank or, at least kind of use its impact on the smaller banks, it's not really clear at this point. He has talked a lot overall about lessening regulations in all kinds of industries, so the idea of making changes to Dodd-Frank is kind of in keeping with that. But again, the specifics aren't really clear at this point.
All right, thank you, Jenny. Our next focus is the workplace and the workforce and regulations affecting basically how people work, how much they get paid for work, how often they work, what kind of vacation they get. It's an issue that has came up quite often in the last election. There were debates about the minimum wage. There have been debates about family leave, about sick leave. Many of these issues have bubbled up through the course of the Obama administration, in part in response to concerns about slow wage growth in this country, which wages have been growing, but clearly there are people who are dissatisfied, and that is part of what has led to that's part of what helped Trump in his campaign. The question now, I suppose, is what will happen under a Trump administration with regulations affecting the workplace, especially when what may be one of his toughest balancing acts will be balancing the interests of business people who are definitely rock solid Republican voters with more working class voters who probably do have some very high expectations from this administration, this incoming administration. So Dave, take it away. Thank you, Joel.
Trump, through the campaign, has been criticized on the minimum wage issue for flip-flopping, and he is now on record as supporting legislation that would increase the federal minimum wage to $10 an hour, which is a great increase over $7.25 an hour as it is now. He had called previous efforts to increase the minimum wage something that would be, quote, too high, but he does back cautious efforts to increase the minimum wage by a good 1/3 or more than a third. one of my experts I interviewed during the campaign said that on some of these workforce issues, he sounds surprisingly like a Democrat. Not completely, but close. On the minimum wage issue especially, it's a surprise to hear him do this as an effort to maybe try to recapture some of the blue-collar vote for the Republican Party was some of the speculation. Another issue where he is surprisingly closer to Hillary Clinton than you would think would be on the issue of paid family and medical leave. One of my experts I interviewed during the campaign said that he thought it was interesting when Trump's daughter Ivanka, many people remember at the GOP convention, she seemed to very clearly put a stake in the ground on this issue, and she sounded a lot more Democratic leaning on these issues like family leave, working mothers, and daycare. And it does seem that Trump would embrace some aspects of that or would be willing to hear details on increasing family leave, which of course Secretary Clinton made almost a foundational aspect of her campaign. On the last issue of these three main issues in the workforce sector, this is probably the largest issue now facing business owners and business people, which of course the new overtime regulations, which was announced in May, the changes to the overtime regulations that are set to take effect on December 1st. And Trump on this has indicated that he would scale back some of the plans for smaller business owners. There are not clear answers on what he means by smaller business. Many people consider smaller business 500 or less. Some consider them 100 or less employees. But he has indicated a willingness to scale that back and be more of a, I guess, traditional Republican business candidate, or now president-elect in that aspect. And just to refresh you, the overtime regulations will make many changes that many of our business owners are familiar with, but the main one is it will double the salary level from around $23,000 to $47,000, under which employees who work more than 40 hours a week must be paid overtime. So Trump in this regard does sound more like traditional business owners president-elect, but on the other issues he has shown much more of a willingness to work with the working level man and woman.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave. All right. We'll first open it up to questions. That concludes our portion. This is our sort of lecturing portion of this event, of this webinar. I'm sure, like us, most of you have been up early, up late, trying to digest all of what this means. We're here to offer our expertise, basically, again, expertise gleaned from our reporting, from talking to business owners in central Pennsylvania, from experts who are familiar with these issues. And we'd love to share our expertise. So let's start with, if we have any questions from our audience, we'll start with those. And then we have, of course, I'm sure questions we would love to be asking each other. So Kathy, do we have any questions?
Yeah, there's one here in the queue. Hi, this is Kathy Herka. I'm the managing editor, and I've been kind of monitoring from behind the scenes. And we do have a question from someone about health insurance, and it's more of a statement, but I kind of understand what they're talking about. They're basically saying health insurance is affordable at this time, and the new rates. Wait a minute, let me go. Health insurance is affordable at this time, and the new rates are out. How can anyone say it's affordable? Only to low income who get it free or almost free. The ones working hard have to pay for that insurance. So the question is, maybe our panel can ask, I mean, what would be considered affordable? And is that on the agenda for Trump to be addressing that? I don't know if you can answer that one.
Sure. Well, there is no doubt that healthcare costs are continuing to rise, not just for individuals, but for employers. Group plans are seeing increases as well. So I think that is going to be a #1 priority for Trump is, figuring out how to lower healthcare costs in our country.
About the competition across the state lines, I mean, opening that up, I mean, they talked a lot about that. Do you think that, is that likely to happen? I mean, if we have a sense that might actually be a priority #1, kind of open it up, get those lines out of there, and let other private companies come in to help drive the cost down?
I haven't heard anyone comment specifically on that so far, but I do know that, like when you look at the Affordable Care Act itself and just the marketplace, the costs went up because health insurance companies were pulling out of it. So I would imagine more options would in fact increase competition and hopefully lower costs.
I have a quick question, and this one's going to go back to Roger. Roger was talking to us about trade and manufacturing. Trump and Clinton went back and forth a lot about NAFTA, and in general, like Trump basically said NAFTA was a disaster. So, Roger, can you give us a general indication exactly what NAFTA is, and then what can, in relation to overall trade,
okay,
when it comes to the country, and what will that mean if NAFTA is dismantled?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. Well, NAFTA grew out of an original FTA, or free trade agreement, between the United States and Canada in 1988. And what that essentially did was to reduce tariffs on a wide range of goods between our two countries. So automobiles were particularly affected. That agreement was extended in 1994 to include Mexico, and it was called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, because it embraces all three countries. What I think is really interesting, I was doing a little bit of reading as we were sitting here, is that, and I had forgotten this, in 1992, Ross Perot, and you may remember that name, he was a bit of a spoiler way back when.
The giant sucking sound.
The giant sucking sound, you got that, Joe, that's exactly right. He was opposed to NAFTA because he said, listen, this is going to drain jobs from the United States, and particularly from the border states.
He heard it coming.
He heard it coming, and what's really interesting about that was that both Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush were in favor of NAFTA. So NAFTA, which is very much despised, I think, by people who are concerned about its effect on manufacturing jobs over the past 25 years, you know, probably should remember that it was the original FTA was drafted under the Reagan administration, completed under George H.W. Bush, endorsed by Bush and Clinton, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, and then, of course, endorsed by a Republican Congress in 1994. So these things were very much the orthodoxy of trade at the time. And what it said was, we're going to eliminate tariffs. So there's one free trade zone stretching from, you know, Mexico to the Arctic Circle. And a couple of the products that are really important that you might want to think about. Automobiles were, you know, probably the most high-profile product to fall under NAFTA. My first car was a Chrysler that was built in Mexico. On the other hand, there is a Ford plant on Lake Ontario in Canada, which builds most of the Fords that are, you know, sort of sold in the United States. And I bet that most of you, regardless of whether you drive, you know, an American branded import, are driving cars with Mexican parts. So a lot of these cars and the parts are made in what the Mexicans call maquiladoras, which are plants down in Mexico, which take, you know, components that are finished off or built, constructed in the United States, and they put them together to form a car, and then the car is sold here or in Canada or where have you. So can President Trump kill NAFTA? And the answer is yes, which may scare a lot of people. Not only because there's a clause in the bill, but his pre-existing powers give Trump the ability to basically give Mexico written notice and say, I'm backing out of the deal. Congress cannot stop him. However, what can happen then is, of course, all the American companies that have plants in Mexico and build things in Mexico or sell American-made products in Mexico face the possibility of a trade war with that country, right? Of the Mexicans saying, okay, well, you know, you ended the deal, no more preferential trade for you. We're going to slap tariffs on your products, and of course Trump says he's going to impose tariffs on theirs. And there's the whole question of the wall, right? I know it's not directly related to NAFTA, but my God, how do you trade with a country with whom you have a wall? So people are a little bit confused about this. One of the very interesting things I do want to say about NAFTA is that particularly those in you know, a lot of Democrats and pro-union Democrats are correct. NAFTA has coincided with the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States since 1994. Academics are sort of torn on this, whether some of those jobs would have been lost anyway. And I've talked to manufacturers here in central Pennsylvania who have said one of the things that has happened in those 25 years, with or without the trade deals, is that we have automated many of our production processes, right? The more we automate what we do, the more we forgive me, use robots and other processes to make things, you don't need as many humans. So, for example, some of the products that Hershey has moved to Mexico aren't necessarily made by a lot of Mexican workers. They're made by machines that are just based in Mexico, where presumably the power is cheaper and the land is cheaper and so forth. So with or without those trade deals, we probably would have lost jobs. And then there are other folks who say that NAFTA has been responsible for the growth of jobs in these countries. And I have to be honest, I could cite 5 sources on both sides, and they will both tell you that it has been, you know, a destructor of jobs, and others will say it has created jobs at a time when traditional manufacturing was dying anyway, and we've actually helped bolster it. So there is no easy answer to that, Kathy. Unfortunately, I know, but Trump can end it. And the question is, if he does that, do we then engage in a full-fledged trade war with a country that borders, 4 of our states, I think? and whether that's ultimately productive for the continent. And again, then there's the Canadian question. Do we also then, does backing out end our trade relationships with Canada, which are often just as close? So I hope that answers it.
Jason Scott wants to ask a question, so we're going to give the floor to him.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question to the group. I mean, we going into the election, we all saw the polls. We all were expecting, I guess, continued gridlock in Washington. We were expecting the Senate to maybe go Democrat. We were expecting Hillary Clinton probably to win based on everything that we were hearing up until this point, and then have the House remain Republican. So there was going to be that gridlock, which is, Wall Street-like, steady. We know what we're getting. They're not going to get too much done. They might get a little, but it's something we can kind of build around. Now that we've seen everything go GOP, I guess that's the question for everybody would be, do you really think you could be able to advance things a lot quicker? I mean, I kind of think yes. I mean, yeah, like what Roger said regarding trade, I think a lot of the industries, things will move a lot quicker than we all thought come, January 20th when he's sworn in. He'll be able to do a lot in those first 100 days. Do you guys get that sense now that, that the Republicans have kind of maintained control of everything?
The assumption would be yes, right, because everyone has the same letter after their name. The reality may be different in that there are going to be competing interests, and we'll probably find out in some ways the narrative flipped, right, or through the election. And before the election, it was the Republicans are imploding, oh no, Democrats are gaining strength. Now we're hearing the Democrats are imploding, Republicans are gaining strength. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. Both parties are facing fractures. And I think it was somewhat addressed, and it was addressed in part in Roger's question, in that in the trade question, there's been this consensus on trade deals between both parties for more than 20 years, right? So both parties share some common outlook on things, even though they disagree on some things. I mean, at one point it's been described as they fight pretty much around the 50-yard line. If you want to use a football analogy, they fight between the 45-yard line and the 45-yard line. The question is, will Trump try to push that past the 45-yard line, or will people try to pull it further? And will there be those who oppose that on the Republican side? Right, there will be fights on the Republican side, probably especially over trade deals, over some of the workplace policies we've discussed. Right.
Joel, when's the last time that we had all of them under one government, under one party?
Actually not Obama's first term. The first 2 years, Obama had a Democratic Senate, but it was a Republican House.
Okay.
I think George Bush did have all three of both chambers for a portion of the time. I think it started out, my memory slips, and I've been up a lot, so
we all have
time to look that one up. I have been trying to search back in my brain. I mean, definitely under Clinton, I think Clinton had Democrats in the very beginning, but then it flipped Republican in 1994 under Gingrich. So Clinton got a lot done, except for health care, ironically enough, in his first 2 years in office. After that, he was pretty much up against Gingrich and Dole for the next 6 years. George Bush, I think that the Senate remained Democrat for most of that period up until 2006, because then he had to work with Kennedy and others on the Democratic side to pass legislation, No Child Left Behind being a big one, and the tax cuts as well, and the war. So I think it'd be easy to overestimate the possibility for everyone to kind of get along. But I also think it's easy to overestimate the possibility for people to just really rip into each other, right? I think they might pick things. Donald Trump is going to have a reputation as a pragmatist, and he's going to want to win, as we've seen. So he will probably pick things on which he knows he can win, and a lot of it's going to come down to the people he picks to advise him. And
that actually is one of the questions in our queue. So I'll put that up to the panel here. Anyone have any insights on who Trump might appoint to high-level cabinet positions? Specifically, they're asking about trade and health care. So if anyone wants to maybe address that, or who they think Trump's going to put in play for that.
There's one name that Jason and I were talking about this morning. I think Congressman Lou Barletta from the 11th District, which of course represents part of our area, but stretches all the way up into Hazelton, northeastern Pennsylvania. He's been a dedicated Trump supporter from the beginning. He was a sort of a Tea Party victor several years ago. You might remember that Congressman Barletta started out in life, or in business rather, as a paving company contractor, and I don't think it would be so ridiculous to imagine him as, you know, the head of the department, the Secretary of Transportation, for one thing. I don't know of a lot of other Pennsylvania names that really come to mind, but that one.
Yeah, we heard Giuliani. His name
Yeah,
I
think we suspect Giuliani will be rewarded for his services somehow. Whether that would be Secretary of State, or maybe more likely something like Homeland Security,
right,
which makes sense given that he was mayor of New York on 9/11. And then there's the ever-ending question of what happens to Chris Christie. He's heading the transition team, but he may not be on the right side of the prison bars for too long. And so, sorry to say, but with his situation, with his situation in New Jersey,
brings risk.
It was really mean.
As a nominee,
he brings risk.
At a time when a lot of other people are going to want jobs in this administration, so I'm sure Trump will be talked out of appointing Christie and giving people a distraction basically from his agenda.
But I would say you heard it here first. I strongly feel that Congressman Barletta is a name that we should watch.
Yeah. And you might get talked out of a lot of names too. A lot of the names that we would just gravitate to right away, because you kind of want some of those people to still be fighting for you in Congress, because some of them, depending on what position, the certain committee positions they have right now. There's certainly some representatives from our area that are big in the transportation areas now. I know, obviously, Congressman Schuster and Scott Perry and others have integral roles in Congress right now that they wouldn't want to maybe take a position in the cabinet, and then you have to kind of lose a little bit of that steam or a little bit of that clout that you've gained over the last couple of years. So maybe it will be some surprise names that emerge, much like his running mate. We were all trying to figure that out for a while.
Right, Mike Pence, who'd have thought. But one name we won't see probably on cabinet appointments is Mark Cuban.
Yeah, you're right, we won't.
But I think it'll be interesting, again, that sort of consensus establishment versus outsider. I think it'll be interesting to see who he picks. I have not seen a long list of names. I know he has a long list of Supreme Court potential nominees. I've not parsed that very deeply, but the main litmus test for me is, will he pick people who kind of represent the consensus, the establishment of the last 20 years, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, or will he look outside of that consensus, that establishment, to select people? Ironically, of course, people like Giuliani would have been seen as inside the establishment 5 years ago or 2 years ago, but through the election, they sort of caught that outsider wave. And by the very nature of being outsiders, we have no idea. It'll also be interesting, just as a side note, I know we have other questions, to see if Trump does pick any Democrats. It has been really it's been since Clinton, and probably maybe even before that. But as long as I've been a reporter, that the president does usually pick someone of the opposite party for at least one or two cabinet posts.
Okay. I have another question in the queue, and this one, it's probably going to go back to Roger. Trade seems to be trade and the manufacturing industry. This is a question. One area that I had a hard time accepting from Trump was the revival of the coal industry, especially steel maybe, but not coal. Do you think economic forces will prevail over any attempt by Trump to revive it?
Well, yes.
Coal and steel.
Coal and steel. Let me speak to coal first. I spent 10 years in northeastern Pennsylvania in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, and I can certainly tell you from the perspective of those regions that coal will not be coming back there for a number of reasons. One is that the mines in that particular part of the state were flooded in the late 1950s and gradually sort of wound down. And so, the infrastructure is not there. And as the United States moved away from coal as a power source, there was really no incentive to do anything to bring it back. There are parts of the country where coal still is important, so it is very possible that there are limited parts of Pennsylvania and certainly West Virginia and some of the western states. So sure, if President Trump wants to invest in that industry, I think he certainly could have success in certain regions. But I would caution folks that the coal industry, which made northeastern Pennsylvania great, is not likely to come back. And frankly, look, the folks who work those jobs will tell you they were hard, difficult, dangerous jobs. So when we talk about bringing back the manufacturing of old, I think there are a lot of people on the ground who would be very careful what you wish for. And that was one of the things that did sort of surprise me. I mean, he garnered a lot of support particularly in Luzerne County and to a lesser extent Lackawanna County. And folks there did, I think, they bristled a little bit at the idea of coal coming back because they know what it was like and they know that it's just not economically viable there. Now, as for steel, steel is a very difficult thing, Kathy. We've done some stories on how the Chinese heavily subsidize their steel industry, and there are reasons for that I won't get into today, but that is where trade and a particular industry really kind of come together. He's going to have to convince the Chinese to stop subsidizing and dumping Chinese steel onto the world market. And that's not just affecting the United States, it's affecting a lot of countries. And they don't do things just because we ask them nicely. And there really isn't right now, I think, a good mechanism, even with the WTO, to make them. So I would not expect steel as we knew it, say, in places like Pittsburgh or to a larger extent in Steelton, will ever come back. And so that's kind of what I think about that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think that's going to be it for now. We went through some of the questions in the queue. If anyone else has any, shoot them to me. But I think in general, we all have to get back to work here.
What?
So I know.
Work. All right.
But thank you for joining us. It's been a good conversation, and we hope to have these more regular, where we can get involved in some of the business conversations in the community. So definitely thank you.
And let me tell you as well, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and if you have a question for us about the election or it's a tip or anything, you can email us at editorial@cpbj.com, and we'll be happy to hear from you. Got to make that pitch.
Thank you.
This ends today's call. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.